All right. I think we should go ahead and get started. I know more people will trickle in as we go, but I just want to give us a good amount of time to have our discussion here. So thanks everybody for coming. Today, we're going to be discussing US border and asylum policy and thinking about suggestions for changes to these policies going forward. So just to give a little intro, this obviously has been a very important topic for many years, but I think I in particular, and probably many of you, have been reminded of its importance in the last month or so, as we've seen some announcements coming from the administration about changes to these policies. So in particular, I've been thinking a lot about Biden's decision to extend Title 42, the Trump era rule that turns away asylum seekers at the southern border. And then just this morning, there was an announcement also from the Biden administration of proposed changes to how the asylum process is administered, switching it from the immigration court system to a more administrative office procedure for processing asylum applications. And that affects individuals, particularly at the southern border. So obviously that's an active policy debate going on right now. And then I also wanted to, of course, note the ongoing crises, the unfolding crises that we're seeing in both Afghanistan and Haiti, and the likely increases, significant increases in refugees that we're going to see as a result of that. So I've been thinking a lot about these policies and our responsibility to create effective policies in light of all this. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today and hearing more from the panelists about these policies and looking forward. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists now, and then I'll talk a little bit about the structure, and then we'll sort of go in the order that I will introduce the panelists. So first we have Dr. Carolyn Heinrich, who received her PhD in public policy from the University of Chicago. And she is currently the Patricia and Rhodes Hart Professor of Public Policy, Education, and Economics at Vanderbilt. And she's also the chair of the Department of Leadership, Policy, and Organizations in the Peabody College of Education and Human Development. She studied immigration policies and how they affect families and children, along with her broader research on how education and safety net policies affect low-income individuals. And in her work, she's also partnered with federal, state, and local governments, as well as NGOs, both in the US and internationally. So I'm looking forward to hearing from her. Then next, we're going to have Dr. Juan Pedroza, who received his PhD in sociology from Stanford University and is now an assistant professor in the sociology department at UC Santa Cruz. He's also an affiliate at the UC Santa Cruz Latin American and Latino Studies Center and has received numerous awards to support his work, including the Emerging Poverty Scholars Fellowship from University of Madison, Wisconsin, Institute for Research on Poverty, and from the Ford Foundation. And he's done extensive research on immigration enforcement policies, as well as looking at disparities in health and economic outcomes across ethnic and immigrant groups. And then finally, we have Professor Joaquin Rubalcaba, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Public Policy and is a faculty fellow with the Carolina Population Center. He earned his PhD in economics from the University of New Mexico and was a Robert Wood Johnson doctoral fellow during his doctorate. His research has focused on immigration policy, including immigration enforcement as well, and DACA, and looking at health disparities also. He has written for the Brookings Institute and is a contributing scholar at the Center for Growth and Opportunity. So we've got a great group of folks here to talk to us about these policies. So as I said, we're going to go in order that I just did the introductions. And then there's also going to be time at the end for a Q&A from the audience. So if you want to participate in the Q&A, please go ahead and submit your questions in the webinar tool panel under questions. You can submit them anytime as we go through, and I'll be reading them out at the end, time permitting. We should have a good amount of time, I think. And then when you are submitting your question, please just do note to try to say which panelist you're addressing your question to when you submit. Okay, I think that's everything. So Carolyn, go ahead. Thanks.
Thanks. So Dr. East was just talking, and she kind of introduced with some recent events and developments in terms of border and asylum policy. But as you will certainly find out from from our discussion today, border policy extends beyond what we think of as officially our borders to the south and to the north. So, for example, we have states with many different types of policies in terms of how they welcome or don't welcome, or how they receive and make it easy for those who come to our borders to settle, or those who cross our borders to make a life here. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we call interior immigration enforcement. And Ryan, are you going to put the slides up, or do you want me to pull slides up?
If you want to pull your slides up, that'd be great.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to host the participant screen sharing is disabled. So.
All right, let me share my screen again. I thought we just tried.
It's okay. Okay, so as I was just mentioning, we have many different policies across the states which affect how immigrants, once they cross our borders, can settle into our country. And as I mentioned, some may be welcoming, but we tend to focus on what's happening in immigration enforcement, because this has some of the largest repercussions for individuals and families. And so one of the things I want to just highlight at the outset is, right now we've been talking for years, right, about federal immigration law and an overhaul of that, and as well as some of the different ways, rules, as Dr. East was mentioning, that can affect who can legally be here in the country. But because we haven't had substantive federal action or major policy reform or changes, states have gone ahead and made a lot of their own policies in terms of how they respond. And of course, it varies considerably. So one of the things I want to point out is that, so we do have federal enforcement actions. And I'm going to kind of just show on this particular slide what's been happening. We have the Department of Homeland Security that was created in 2003. And both Department of Homeland Security and Immigration's Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Patrol, that spending has nearly tripled. So we have a lot of immigration enforcement, and this is not just at the border, it's happening throughout the country. In addition, I was just mentioning state immigration laws, resolutions, as well as different types of administrative provisions have also absolutely exploded in the last decade and a half. And so it was a very sharp rise in activity among states from like about 2006. It kind of peaked in 2015. So in 2015 alone, there were 216 laws and 274 resolutions passed, oriented towards in ways that affect the lives of people who have come to settle here in the US or are working here. Now, since that period, 2016 to 2020, on average, about 157 laws were enacted and 174 resolutions passed on average across the state. So this is still a very highly active area of policy activity. And because it's not major federal legislation, many of us may miss the consequences. But those who are living or trying to do, for example, families trying to just get access to basic services and supports for their children, whether it's healthcare, a program like Women, Infants, and Children. We know that these policies have had substantial effects on them from not just research, a whole body of research that has been emerging as people have studied this. You can go ahead and advance, Ryan. And the other thing I just wanted to share today is one other immigration enforcement tool that we hadn't seen really happening since the George W. Bush administration was brought back by the Trump administration. And that is they revived workplace raids as another key enforcement tool. And so initially they were concentrated mostly in the Midwest and South, and going after kind of manufacturing sites in those communities. But what I'm going to share with you a little bit of just an example of the repercussions of these types of policies, and talk about the context of those who are affected, the communities that are affected. So we can go ahead and advance. So this is just a quick graphic to show what I was just describing to you. So this is the Customs and Border on the left, the Customs and Border Patrol and ICE annual budgets from 2003 to 2021. You can see how substantially they've increased. And on the other side, it shows initial bookings and arrestings by these two agencies, Customs and Border Patrol and ICE. You can also see the substantial increase. And this is just over the most recent fiscal years for which we have these data. So they're not just that they're getting more money, they're really actively out there, looking to enforce policies. And again, these are policies that sometimes federal and state cooperate, sometimes state and local cooperate, sometimes you have conflict between federal, state, and local as these policies are actually enacted and in practice. So we can go on to the next slide. And I'm just going to show on this next slide what I was pointing out to, the revival of the workplace immigration raids. So the last raid that was held before these were revived by Trump, and this is all just showing during the Trump years, was 2000, early Bush years, 2003. So you can see, and those are arrests made in raids. You can see that this is a hard-hitting enforcement tool. Okay, so before we go on to the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about, what we're seeing in the research in terms of how this is affecting families. So, for example, we know that many families are of mixed status, meaning that they have maybe one family member who is immigrant, but they may have U.S. citizen children, or a mix of children who are, have citizenship status, and those who don't. We sometimes call those folks unauthorized. Sometimes they may have one parent that's unauthorized and one parent that's not, sometimes both parents. But what this has meant in practice for children and families as they've tried to navigate their lives here is that these policies have typically created what we typically burdens or barriers to them to getting the support they need. So for example, policies I studied when I was in Texas that were also picked up by other states, which restricted identification that parents could use to make that parent-child link, made it difficult for families to sign up for those early intervention programs for their children, to register the kids for preschool, to register kids for regular school. And in interviews and empirical work I've done, we've also spoken with parents that have mixed status children, where some children are, U.S. citizens and some children are still unauthorized. They've described differences in terms of what they could provide to their children because of their restricted access to these programs. The public charge rule that some of you may be aware of, that was first brought forth by the Trump administration, was struck down later. It doesn't matter that public charge rule was struck down. That is still having an effect on families who are worried. The concern was, the idea was that if they accepted any kind of public assistance, that could derail their efforts to their legal pathway to citizenship in the US. So that, even though that rule was ultimately struck down, when you go and talk to people on the front lines, they are still very concerned about it. And so sometimes parents, even if some of their children are US citizens and can access these benefits and supports, and that also varies across states, right? Different states have made exceptions to allow children, regardless of their status, to access important benefits, and some haven't. So continue to restrict it. And so we've seen that some families will just not go at all. And I've heard this across every area of social policy, even parents afraid to go to workforce development centers because there's a guard that sits at a desk and asks for an ID, regardless of what, and even though in the US, our workforce development centers do not require someone to be a US citizen in order to use those services to be connected with employment. So now I just want to come back, and I'm just going to share quickly some very preliminary findings from our work in Tennessee, where we looked at the the Morristown, Tennessee immigration raid that happened in April 2018, it was the first big raid of the Trump administration. If you just go ahead to the next slide, it's my last slide, Ryan. I want to show, so there's some headlines up there about how students are affected, but we are looking here at, we have health and education data linked for children, and we're compare kids who were in the community where the raid happened with those who were not, kind of zones in terms of their distance. And what you see in this particular graphic here is, so the raid happened on April 5th, and you can see that spike. That spike is comparing children of immigrants and children who aren't immigrants in the county where it happened. And so that's on the left-hand side, and then the right-hand side just compares children of immigrants and non-children immigrants in that zone. So the first one is the county where it happened versus those not in that county. Another one is children of immigrants versus not those who aren't children of immigrants. You can see the huge spike in their absences. It's a 20% increase. It was over 500 kids, and that you can't see as well, but it went on for a week. And then the school counselors talked about for weeks after that how students were sick with fear. And they also described, and this is one of the headlines there, people, even if they weren't children of immigrants, if their identity was Hispanic, they felt targeted, because that's exactly how the raid happened. It just brought in anybody who was Hispanic, regardless if they worked at this particular plant. So I'm going to just close here, but I want to say that because we've linked health and education data, we've been able to look at other effects that this raid has on children, and they're pervasive in terms of their health as well as behavioral disorders like substance misuse, sexual abuse, maltreatment in the family, the disciplinary actions in school. So these raids rarely actually net people whose arrest is fully prosecuted, and it's having very damaging consequences on children. So I'm going to turn it over, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to share what's happening within our borders.
Thanks, Carolyn. So next we have Dr. Juan Pedroza. Go ahead.
Thank you for that background. That really helps contextualize some of what I'll be talking about and building on the context and the relevant policies. So I want to focus on two issues in my time here. One is this issue of which kinds of policies are intended to harm immigrants, and which sorts of policies exist and are put out into the world that don't necessarily have the intent of harming someone, but nevertheless we can see some of these perhaps long-term effects or direct effects beyond who we would think would be affected. So that's one. And the other issue is, if we flip sort of the point of view as policy scholars to I mean, we're all researchers, we're all paying very close attention to current events, to how do we measure these issues and animate them and give them real life. But what if we flipped the point of view to imagine what it must be like learning about what US institutions mean as a new arrival? And think about this as a new arrival who came without inspection, without authorization, as well as arrivals who came seeking asylum and presenting themselves to Border Patrol. What sorts of lessons are new arrivals learning about what it means to be part of the US? And we can all have, those of us who've lived here for a long time, I've been here since 1989, I bring a lot to the table in terms of things that I've learned over time, to the extent that I think US institutions are really helpful or really harmful. I think we all have a bundle of ideas in our head about which institutions are helpful and which are not. But for a moment, just pause on that and flip it to someone who doesn't have that background, doesn't have that history, and is learning a lot of this under duress or on the fly, and in bits and pieces. So I think those are the two things that I wanted to focus on. And we have a lot of people in the audience here today, just scanning at the list of attendees, a lot of knowledge. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, terrific expertise on health, education and absenteeism, housing and sanctuaries, labor markets, crime and domestic violence, business ownership, nonprofits, new destinations. We're really covering a lot of ground, not just on the panel, but with our attendees. So some of what I'll be talking about deals directly with the expertise in the room, and I'll hopefully be offering some new insights based on my ongoing project on immigration scams. So before we get there, we're 20 years into this experiment now, where we've decided, especially after 2001 and kicking really into high gear after the creation of Department of Homeland Security, as we heard, new laws, new ordinances, new administrative procedures proliferating at the federal, state, and local level. So they're coming from lots of different sources, and it is important to keep them distinct. They're not all working in one direction. Some of them are helping, and some of them are intending to really strike fear into the heart of immigrants' lives. That's the intention of many of these things. Not all of them, and we often overlook efforts to integrate immigrants. But in the last 20 years, we do see a return of exclusion that we hadn't seen in a very long time, both for unauthorized immigrants, so people who came on a visa and maybe overstayed that visa, as well for people who cross the border with someone else's documents or under without inspection, who we typically refer to as unauthorized, as well as asylum seekers and unaccompanied minors and children. We've been in this almost 20 years where the Office of Refugee Resettlement, for example, has been trying to address the ongoing numbers of people coming to the border. So we're 20 years into this experiment. And if you scan the research, the policy, and the advocacy literature, we have some real clear evidence of the most direct effects. And the most direct effects is partially driven by who these policies are intended to affect. It's also partially driven by our attention span as policy scholars. I think we are right to point to mixed status households where there are perhaps parents who are unauthorized and are parents of US born children. That tends to be a really compelling way to frame research. It's the way that I've framed much of my work. I think in focusing on mixed status households, in focusing on US born children and students, we learn a lot, and we've learned about the intended effects on those mixed status households in terms of fear, absenteeism that we just heard about, housing instability, and some work that I'm doing right now. I think what we miss are some of the other intended direct effects that get lost when you are not in what is traditionally thought of as a sympathetic immigrant category. So if you don't have kids, if you are a recent arrival and you're a high priority for enforcement and removal and haven't had the time to put down roots in the US, in the eyes of Homeland Security, you're a top priority for removal. And if you look at the policy and the advocacy space, there's not a whole lot of room to advocate on behalf of new arrivals. And for a long time, that wasn't necessarily a crisis because we could talk about long-term settled immigrants and mixed status households and US born children with immigrant parents and learn a lot. And I think what the new lessons we're learning now is by not arming ourselves as an interested audience in immigration, we didn't have the right frame of reference to talk about the rise in unaccompanied minors at the same time that you got unauthorized migration from Mexico specifically falling to net zero. We just didn't have the vocabulary. We didn't have a way of talking about the lived realities of, say, Central American youth who came here and didn't see themselves as dreamers, didn't want to be dreamers, and presented themselves to Border Patrol proactively. And then you get this this dance of, are we talking about refugees or are we talking about immigrants in ways that were not necessarily tremendously helpful. And I think we can recognize that the line between refugee and, say, economic immigrant can be blurry. We can recognize that that line can be blurry without weaponizing that reality against someone who wants to make an asylum claim. So I think we can all be a lot more deliberate and explicit about when we're evaluating a policy or an administrative change, who is that policy intended to affect? And is the way that we talk about it having these other downstream sorts of consequences? And I'll just give an example from a project that I'm working right now that keeps me up at night. If you worry about US norms, trust in US institutions, the legitimacy of our institutions, then we should have systems, unequal as they might be, that we all at least believe we're getting a fair shake. And we're getting research from across the country, including some of mine. And I would encourage people to read the work of Apollone Calderon, who's in the room here, on nonprofits and access to legal representation, and some other work by Emily Rio at USC, who's been documenting what happens to people in removal proceedings, or people, long-term settled immigrants, asylum seekers, who do versus do not have access to capable legal representation. And the consequences can be really, really dramatic, not just in your likelihood of being removed, but just as fundamentally, whether or not you believe that you got a fair shake. Once your case was finally decided, do you believe that US courts and immigration courts themselves are legitimate? And that might sound like not the most consequential thing in the world, except if we want to have into the next 20 years a sense that people will understand and comply with decisions that we as a collective have made about how to deal with refugees and immigration, we want as many people as possible to believe that at least the system worked. The more we erode that fundamental belief, the more we're going to be right back where we were in the 1990s, where we raise up border militarization only to have the unintended effects of a caging consequences of immigrants deciding, I'm just going to stay here. Instead of doing what I used to do, which was circular migration. We're going to go right back down that road in new and creative ways if asylum seekers and new arrivals have no faith that they're going to get their cases heard. And I'll end here on a note from a project on immigration scams that I'd be happy to talk about in Q&A, where everyday people who've been here maybe a year, maybe 10 years, go out and look for legal aid or access to legal representation, only to later find out that the website or the lawyer or the organization that they were talking to was incompetent, fake, or fraudulent. And the consequences of those sorts of scams are going to be with us for a long time, in ways that you can only begin to imagine. So I'll pause there, and looking forward to hearing from Joaquin and from the rest of everyone here in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Juan. Joaquin, go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. So can y'all see my slides here?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Sorry, I was giving you all a tour through all my slides. So I think my discussion here, I think complements both Caroline and Juan's presentation, but more or less, what the focus of my talk here is going to be on U.S.-born children within these mixed status families and some of the outcomes of immigration enforcement, or some of the impacts of immigration enforcement on these particularly vulnerable families. And there's a lot that's going on right now and changes, especially with this new administration. There's been this reshaping of the immigration enforcement apparatus. Namely, the president has attempted to temporarily halt deportations and reprioritize the U.S. immigration enforcement strategy. And when I look at U.S. immigration policy and the landscape for which migrants are living in this country, policy at the federal level hasn't really changed a lot. But what does change from one administration to the next is the reprioritization of the U.S. immigration enforcement strategy, and we see that this really happened with the transition between the Trump administration and to the Biden administration. And what we see, what I think is relatively unique about the Biden administration, there's been this push for an immigration reform bill where the administration has prioritized a pathway to citizenship for dreamers, family reunification, the modernization of the immigration court system, and worker protection. Now, while this approach isn't about face from the previous administration, there still remains this deep concern and how this ultimately affect immigrants and their families and their communities for which they live in. Now, we have to keep in mind that while the administration is, retooling the U.S. immigration enforcement strategy, there's been a long history and arguably a deeply rooted anti-immigrant culture that's embedded within the agencies that enforce U.S. immigration policies, as well as the agencies that support enforcement efforts that are situated at the local level. But nonetheless, as policies change and priorities are retooled from one administration to the next, the agencies and the policies that have facilitated the pursuit of aggressive immigration enforcement strategies, over the last 20 years, is likely to remain a constant for the foreseeable future. And we see this even with, the House resolution, the new U.S. immigration reform bill, where they're addressing some deep concerns about immigrant families and immigration and refugees, but they're not really addressing secure communities policies or the 287G, overall the localization of immigration enforcement. And so this is definitely a deep concern here. Now, if we look here at the slides, the outcomes of these strategies, primarily as a result of secure communities and the delegation of federal authority that's situated at the local level, 287G, ICE has conducted, just in 2019 alone, approximately 165,000 detainer requests that were fulfilled. So this is somebody came in contact with a local law enforcement agency, and then that information went to ICE, and then ICE submitted a detainer request. When we look at administrative arrest, this is not detainer request, but an actual within the community arrest. We see just in 2019 alone that there were approximately 143,000 arrests conducted by ICE. Now, removals, on the other hand, this is removals that were conducted by ICE, but the apprehending agency was in conjunction with both ICE and CBP. But this is just one time slice in time about some of the operations and immigration enforcement actions conducted by ICE and Customs and Border Patrol. If we look at a little bit longer period between 2014 and 2018, looking only at removals where ICE was the arresting agency, we see that ICE deported approximately 500,000 immigrants here in this country. And the target of the group is 97% were of Latino descent. And what I think is really concerning here is that of this 500,000, of the 500,000 that were deported, approximately 140,000 had at least one U.S.-born children. So this is getting at the crux of the mixed status family, or trying to understand U.S. immigration policy from the mixed status family. So taking this particular statistic, if we assume that on an average there are 2 U.S.-born children for each one of these 140,000 deportees, this would imply that approximately 2% of all U.S.-born children in mixed status families with at least one unauthorized parent have had experienced the deportation of one parent. Now, this is taken over between 2014 and 2018. To understand this particularly vulnerable population, that's experiencing high rates of family separation due to immigration enforcement policies here in the U.S., I described just trying to understand what the basic formation of the mixed status family is. Now, the easiest way to think about it, or the most basic way to think about this, is to construct U.S.-born children from the American Community Survey, where there's at least one foreign-born parent. So in a household where there could be two, or a single parent household, we're just looking, is there at least one parent foreign-born? And we see that the representation is about 24% of all U.S. born children. And then we break this down a little bit more into characterizing the mixed status family typology based on at least one non-citizen parent. We see that there are a substantial number of U.S. born children, between 11 and 15% of the total U.S. born or of the U.S. born children here in the U.S. This is substantial. And we should also note here that approximately 3% of these children have at least one older non-citizen sibling in the household, which the other panelists had mentioned, further stratifies the access to public resources within the household. So you can have one child that's accessing Medicaid program, but the other one isn't. So it stratifies not only immigration status in the household, but also the access to these public resources. So now, if we look at the basic socioeconomic conditions of U.S. born children in these mixed status households, we see a varying degree of vulnerability based on a more in-depth family typology here. And so what I did here was to break or to describe mixed status families between what I am calling mitigated and the unmitigated. So the mitigated, considering only two-parent households where there is at least one non-citizen parent, but the other parent is a foreign-born citizen or a U.S.-born citizen. And what we see here is, a slightly lower poverty rate than U.S.-born children where both parents are, or the only parent is U.S.-born. But we see in terms of health insurance coverage that the coverage rate is relatively the same as the U.S.-born children with U.S.-born parents. But this is not necessarily the case where for the unmitigated. So this is considering only two-parent households again. So we have similar comparisons where both parents are non-citizens. And what we see here is that a substantially higher rate of poverty, 26%, which is higher by a substantial amount, with also the uninsured rate, right? So if we look at all U.S.-born children in this mixed status, the unmitigated mixed status typology, family typology, about 9% are uninsured. But when we break this down into groups that are eligible for Medicaid, based off the federal poverty line, what we see is that there really is no change in the health insurance coverage rate for this particular group. So this underscores the vulnerability that U.S.-born children mixed status families live in. But this isn't the only area that we've measured disparate outcomes for U.S.-born children within mixed status families. So my co-author and I on another study, or co-authors and I on another study, have linked immigration enforcement, variations in immigration enforcement to increase labor supply among high school aged US-born youth within these mixed status families. And then we're also showing that these variations in immigration enforcement lead to lower enrollment rates, as well as for unborn, presumed US-born but unborn children, we see an increase in the probability of preterm births among foreign-born Hispanic mothers here within the U.S. So what I kind of want to switch gears here a little bit, because we had this real surface conversation about mixed status families and just describing a little bit the levels of vulnerability within this particular group. But how does immigration enforcement actually impact this group? And I kind of want to talk a little bit, about how the immigration enforcement strategy can be confounded at the intersection between the federal and local government, at the federal and local government levels, specifically when there's competing governmental priorities. basically competing interests between ICE and the local law enforcement agencies. And so one really good example of this is with the rollout of secure communities, there was an increase in demand to utilize the detainer request. And what we see is that in some larger counties, specifically Mecklenburg County here in North Carolina, we see that the sheriff's department basically just stopped fulfilling those requests because there was no precedent to keep these individuals. At the same time, it was a huge cost burden to keep them for up to 48 hours. And so what happened was the Department of Homeland Security, or ICE, set up these billboards all around Charlotte, and basically was communicating this anti-immigrant, or pushing this anti-immigrant rhetoric, saying basically that the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office was releasing criminal immigrants or unauthorized immigrants into the community. And so we see this conflation of the criminal, legal, and the immigration systems, where there's a push to localize and criminalize immigration within these communities. And so what I want to show here is that there was something that happened that's really interesting between sanctuary and non-sanctuary counties. So what I wanted to show is that on the x-axis here, what we have is time expressed in months. And basically what I'm doing here is an event analysis for arrest. So this is administrative level arrest between sanctuary and non-sanctuary counties. So 0 is when on average the sanctuary counties implemented their, so it's normalized, implemented their sanctuary policies. Now we could see before they actually implemented their sanctuary policies, the number of administrative arrests were relatively low, which is intuitive because ICE was relying on the detainer requests. But then once we see the implementation of the sanctuary policy by the sanctuary counties, we see an increase in the number of administrative arrests. Now, pay close attention here. This 0 month mark right here, 2 months after that 0 month mark, so 1 and then 2, we have a substantial spike in the number of administrative arrests, which is, it looks like it's almost retaliatory in nature. And so what we have is, what this suggests is that no longer is ICE conducting immigration enforcement actions within the jailhouse. They're taking the information that they get from secure communities and taking that to their front door. And so that not only implicates the individual that they're looking for, but everyone else in that household as well. What we see here is if we run this analysis between sanctuary and non-sanctuary counties on the probability of preterm births, we see that before they implemented the sanctuary county policies, relative to non-sanctuary county policies, this is specifically reducing the sample to foreign-born Hispanic mothers. What we see is that there's really no impact on preterm births before. But then if we go 1-2 months after the implementation of the sanctuary policies, we have this spike here. Now, this is just preliminary evidence, but at the very least, what it suggests is that when we think that a policy like sanctuary county policies are to the benefit of immigration enforcement, that ICE is ultimately the priorities that are set by the administration for ICE to conduct their immigration enforcement activities. We see that ultimately that is the mediating factor, whereas the policies that are instituted at the local, state, and federal level are the moderating factor when we think about how aggressive immigration enforcement is. And so I want to open it up for any questions that y'all might have, and thank you very much for everything.
Thank you, Joaquin, and thank you, everyone. That was all really interesting, and I took a lot of notes and a lot to think about, I think, going forward. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat that I will start with. We've got about 10 minutes for Q&A. And then depending on if more questions trickle in, I have a couple of questions myself that I may ask also. There are quite a couple of questions related to how different groups, where I use group is a very broad term here. You can think about countries of origin potentially as a divider. Different groups are treated differently, particularly when we're thinking about asylum seekers, and sort of thinking about why that might be and the interactions of policies that target different groups. So let me read those questions, but that's kind of my broad umbrella thinking about what these questions are. So the first is from Francisco, and they ask, I live in Seattle, which has a long history of refugee resettlement. For example, Afghan refugees are en route here right now. Given the irregular, inconsistent policies and support around refugees as a particular subset of immigrants at the state and federal levels, what are other ways that systemic failures affecting one group affect the other? Or is this even the appropriate division of groups or question to ask? We'll start with that.
I think I just want to make respond to that, but also address another comment that was in there about the challenge we're talking about these different groups, right?
Yeah.
So if you think more broadly about how does what's happening at the border or to asylees connect to our broader immigration policy or people who come over, is the challenges that our immigration policy has created this huge backlog, right? Of people wanting to come in for various reasons. They have family or for work or, Juan mentioned, economic reasons or for reasons where they're fearing for their lives, right? And so one of the challenges, so we've made it more difficult for people to come on these lines are sometimes decades long in terms of where you might be. And then now we've made it very difficult even for asylees, right? And so, I think the way to jump ahead of the line, right, would be to make the case, right, that your life is threatened, as we see with the people in Afghanistan, real viscerally, right? Lives feeling that people have days. And so we've complicated that whole process, right? You can see that with the Remain in Mexico policy that was instituted on the previous administration. We've kept asylees in line now at our border, right? Where we haven't been giving them the process that we, kind of agreed to internationally or that is expected internationally. We've kind of now also made that, I think, Chloe, you mentioned at the very beginning, right? That's something that has not changed yet, right? We are still making it difficult for asylees. So now you have people who want to come into the country for valid reasons and are, sometimes doing it in other ways because, we're not recognizing that their families are being threatened. And the other thing I think is important to mention, how it ties into what we were talking about, is that the previous administration, by reducing the number of asylees and refugees that it was accepting, when we have a whole infrastructure in the United States for serving those organizations. I live in Nashville, and we saw multiple longstanding refugee and asylee support organizations have to close their doors because that cut off the federal funding, right? So federal funding follows the number of refugees. When they substantially reduce that, and as you saw, the Biden administration has gradually, right, led up on that. They also cut off the funding by which these organizations use to receive and connect those people with the supports they need to be successful here in our country. So it is all, in a sense, interconnected, right? And then the other thing is, to the extent that, like I mentioned, and it was also discussed, the level of cooperation and or between federal, state, and local is important, and there have been a lot of tensions there. And so those are really good questions, and I wish it wasn't so messy, but it's messy in part because our policies are in effect a mess and have not addressed some of the core issues.
I agree, and I think that actually ties in kind of nicely with one of the other questions, which was about sort of being clear about the difference between asylees and economic immigrants or immigrants for other reasons. And I do think that it is messy, and even I on this panel am struggling to use exactly the right precise language. So I do think that that's complicated. Any other responses to that before I go on?
Really briefly here, again, if we look at this from the point of view of someone in need of assistance, someone who needs help, you need information, you need access to the safety net, you need a lawyer, you need information about how things work. Some of those things are going to be the safety net targeted to low-income working families. Some of these things are going to be neighborhood-based in terms of community-based organizations. Some of these organizations, and I think about this all as welcoming policies, things that are intended to improve trust, to improve integration, and to mitigate harmful effects. Sanctuary policy is another one that we heard about, as long as that sanctuary actually means something and has teeth, that isn't just a piece of paper. All of these things stitched together in equally complex ways, just as groups that they're trying to serve come from different backgrounds. I think it's tempting to see the bureaucratic categories, like, are you in this visa category versus this other visa category? Are you unauthorized, or are you lawfully permanent resident? Did you overstay a visa, or did you come in without inspection? We can get into the complexity, probably not in the next 7 minutes. But I think another way to think about it is, if you're just looking for information, how do we build a robust system of welcoming policies, welcoming organizations with built-in redundancies and mechanisms, so that no matter who you are, there's no wrong door? And just to answer one of Francisco's questions in the chat, we have a terrific evidence from a book I highly recommend on this topic called Welcoming New Americans, by Abigail Fisher Williamson. And she finds that places that have these sorts of built-in redundancies that have been structured to serve refugees and do refugee resettlement, those places are particularly good at doing lots of other things. So Seattle is the example you mentioned. I would point to Chicago as another example of really, really resilient organizations that communicate with each other and that have a really good lay of the land. And whoever comes through their door, probably gonna be able to help you. And that's what I find in my work on scams. People don't report scams unless organizations are on the ground that can say, hey, do you know that you have rights? Do you know that what happened to you is wrong? Do you know that you can get some of your money back? Do you know, thankfully, under the Biden administration, we're starting to create new categories of relief for removal if you were a victim of domestic violence. Read Ashley and Catalina's work on this. Do you know that you can get relief if you're a victim of a crime? We need to experiment with many, many more of those kinds of ways to make sure that we've built in a really robust welcoming system. And I'll end there, and I hope I've also addressed Elizabeth Acker's terrific question on the mismatch. And that's the big puzzle. What do we do about places that are not interested and don't have the history of anything that I just mentioned? They're actually trying to go in the opposite way.
Yeah, thank you. That was really helpful. And I was also thinking that tied in really nicely with Elizabeth's question about places that have more recent histories of strong enforcement and lack of services to counteract that. And I will also say that my own research, and I think Juan, your research supports this too, suggests that enforcement activity is very strong in places that have historically not had many immigrants living in them. And I think that that is also indicative of a potential mismatch there as well. Okay, so let me get, oh, sorry.
Chloe,
yeah,
I would like to add to that
please.
point, is that especially within the South, what you would see is in immigrant communities where there's high levels of immigration enforcement, that also has an impact on other minority groups, which may cause resentment. There's a working paper that I'm been pursuing on 287G within North Carolina specifically, and we see that there's an increase in racial profiling of motorists, but then we also see an uptick in the profiling or an uptick in the number of Black motorists that are also being pulled over, and so we see that 287G has not only had a negative impact on racial profiling of Hispanic motorists, but Black motorists as well, which could create some racial and ethnic tensions within these communities, which you point out have historically had a large number of immigrant communities, population.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm trying to get, there's a few more questions trickling in now, so I'm trying to get through as many as we can. The question from Marcella is, coming from a social work and public health background, I am curious about comparing our efforts to identify all of the harms experienced by immigrant persons and their families compared to the limited efforts to leverage business, industry, and other economic interests that can build on the natural strength of the immigrant community and its entrepreneurship. Rather than viewing this solely as an economic survival mechanism, how can we bring business partners to the table to share this conversation? Which I think is a really interesting question, because that is a very different perspective than what we've been talking about so far.
Yeah, it's really interesting. If you look, for example, at labor force participation rates, we've been really concerned that we've seen, for example, male labor force participation rates kind of leveling off and declining. But if you look within subgroups, you look at immigrants and Hispanics, their labor force participation rates are like 20 points above the average. So businesses need, I mean, we know they need this. You can look across, every state has industries which rely heavily on their labor and understand that. And unfortunately, someone asked a question about, politics too. I mean, so unfortunately, politics gets in the way of, I think, those kinds of meaningful conversations. And how can we recognize that, when we do value and use immigrant labor and ingenuity, their rates of small business creation are higher as well. How can we recognize, if we value those aspects of it, we also need to value the need that the part they want to build a life here, right? Not just their work, but make it easy for their families to live here, make it easy for them to integrate to communities. And that's some point of really important point, that there should be consensus among groups, industry, as well as some other agents, government agencies we talked about, to be more welcoming and be more supportive because of the strengths that they bring to our communities. Not to mention just diversity, we can all really appreciate.
Yeah, I'll just also add another, shameless plug for my own work, which is looking at secure communities and the labor market effects of that policy, and finds that when enforcement goes up because secure communities is in place in a local area, total employment goes down, and that includes employment of both foreign-born workers and US-born workers. And that's for exactly the reasons that Caroline was just talking about. Foreign-born workers are essential to our economy right now. Anything else to add? We are running out of time, so I just want to see if anybody else has something to jump in with before we wrap up.
I'll just say we need asylum and amnesty.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks everybody for participating. This was a fantastic panel, and thanks to our panelists for telling us about their work and sharing their expertise with us. Hope everybody learned a lot. And there will also be a recording of this posted online afterwards, so feel free to share with anybody who might be interested. So thanks. Take care.